Welcome to Hey Listen, where we discuss faith, leadership, and the mission of the church. We're so glad you've joined us. Now to today's episode. All right, we're ready for part 2 to our conversation on the Bible. So if you're just jumping into this episode, obviously you're just jumping into this episode, we're just starting. But this series, we did a part 1 on how we got the Bible and the kind of the history of that over time. But today we're going to talk more about the translations of the Bible, which I have been really excited because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. My first question really is just, why are there so many different Bible translations and how do we get to that point?
So this, I think, episode is going to be a lot more practical.
Yes, absolutely.
Because we understand that what we talked about last time was about Greek manuscripts and all those things. But really, we need that episode to explain why there's so many translations.
For sure. Yes.
Because it's not like, translation is always hard. If you've ever learned a second or third language or anything like that, you know that, okay, the word can mean this, but it could also mean that. Translation is from one language to another is never an easy thing.
Sure.
So that right there would tell you why there are different translations, and people have opinions. Scholars even will disagree. Well, I like this translation of that word a little better than this translation.
Okay.
So that's part of it. So I looked it up. I was curious myself. How many English translations are there? Nearly 900.
Wow.
Now, that number is sort of silly because there have been, since the year 2000, over 100 different translations, and you won't know any of those.
Okay.
Really, when it comes down to the translations that if you go to CPO or go to a bookstore, there's probably a couple dozen translations out there that are still, used. And the most famous of all is the King James Version, of course, especially in the United States. That's not necessarily true in other places, like in England and stuff like that necessarily. Revised Standard Version might be a little bit more popular over there. I don't know, which we can get here. I mean, it's a little more rare. But so the translations are varied because there are varying philosophies of how we translate. So let's talk about 3 basic, like I said, there's probably, if you go to a bookstore, there might be 10 or 15 different options, but they're all going to use one of 3 basic philosophies. The first one is kind of like a functional equivalent or a literal word for word. So the King James, the New American Standard Bible, they're aiming for that.
Okay.
The problem with that kind of translation is it can be, the word they use is wooden. It can be not as poetic. And again, you start to stumble over the words a little bit sometimes because the flow from, say, Hebrew to English or Greek to English is difficult. So there's that. Then there's formal, there's functional. Functional equivalent is more thought for thought. Well, that sounds really good because now that's the real meaning. Right. But now, notice what you're doing there.
Sure.
There's a little bit more like, okay, who gets to decide what the thought is?
Yeah.
So that's your NIV, New Living Translation.
Okay.
There's a third that's a little more modern, and it is actually my preference, where you try to strike a balance between those two. The English Standard Version does it, and they call that, let me get the right, they call it an essentially literal.
Okay.
So I had to think about that for a moment. I'd forgotten, essentially literal. So what that basically means is they're going to probably err on the side of the more word for word, like the New American Standard, or the King James. But they also have seen value, like with the NIV in particular. There are some translations there that when you really get down into the study of the Greek or the Hebrew, you say, okay, they hit a home run there. That is a really good way to think about that phrase or that word. So those are the 3 basic options. And some of the more modern translations are going to be like the ESV. They're attempting to find that synthesis between the wooden literal and the more, free-form NIV. NIV is not too bad. The NLT, New Living Translation, people ask me about it all the time. I'm just not a fan. I think they go way too far down, guesswork.
Okay.
But it's not like heresy. It's just preference.
Okay. Where does CSB fall in that?
So the CSB is a modern translation that's going to be more like the ESV.
Okay.
So
okay.
the Christian Standard Bible, which is the Holman production, this is the Baptist one. I guess we should use that, but I've not been a fan. I've not been a huge fan of it. I like the ESV better.
Okay.
And I don't know if my Baptist friends think I'm evil now. I don't really care. But anyway, I had some issues with it early on. They actually fixed those issues. I don't want to get into it. There were some things I didn't like about it in its earlier iterations.
Okay.
And I didn't like write a letter to the editor or anything, but what's funny is the things that I didn't like about it, they fixed within the next few years.
Interesting.
I think it's a solid translation.
Yeah.
I've gone ESV, so I just didn't go back. But.
Yeah, that's what we do all of our teaching out of for kids ministry.
Solid.
That's what Lifeway curriculum comes in.
Solid.
And so that's what I use personally when I'm preparing to teach, but when I'm doing my quiet time, I use ESV, ESV study Bible.
Yeah. And here we use ESV because I've really just grown to love it, but I also knew some of the I've actually been taught by some of the guys that were involved in the translation. That's true though. I also was taught by some of the guys that did the Christian Standard Bible. So I actually know a couple of those scholars too, over the years, just, by God's grace, I've got to meet them and they're all wonderful. The guys I knew were in the Old Testament. The issues I had with the Holman Standard, the Christian Standard Bible, were in the New Testament, actually. In the Pauline epistles, there were some translations there that I didn't feel like were adequate. And I'm no Greek scholar, but I no more than I knew. I saw some things I didn't like, and evidently I wasn't the only one.
You weren't the only one.
Yeah. So they fixed those things. Yeah. And I want to say this: whether you're a King James Version person or an ESV person or in an IV, it is so important for you to understand the Bible is such a beautiful, powerful book, and the nuance and the differences in between. You are not going to be misled. I mean, I'm sure someone would argue with me that the King James is better here or there, but in my experience, the essentials of your faith, those translations shouldn't mess that up. Now, it will sometimes cause a person to say, well, I think the Baptists are right, or the Presbyterians are right, or the Anglicans are right because of a translation. There's no doubt that there can be denominational differences from translation to translation, potentially, but not the essentials of the faith, not at all.
You said, the word for word, thought for thought, and what was the other essential? Yeah,
so the one that's the more modern is the essentially, it's adverbial. Essentially literal.
Literal, okay.
Yeah, literal.
So where does paraphrase fall into that?
So paraphrase is going to be like a radical example of like the New Living Translation, where they're just... Yeah, it's more that, maybe even beyond that, where they're just trying their best to put it in the most accessible language. So sometimes you'll even see like they'll try to write it in street slang or something like that. And there's a couple examples of that I don't need to get into, but I don't think that's helpful because at that point you're not even trying to connect with the Greek or the Hebrew. You're just trying to connect with the modern parlance, the modern expressions. That's a dangerous way to do it.
So you don't even really recommend like reading ESV and then reading another, like a paraphrase version?
Not a fan.
Okay.
Not a fan. Yeah. I don't. I think that the further we get away from the scholarship, I think the wooden literal can be dangerous because sometimes it's not giving us what the original intent was. That's why I like the ESV. I mean, it's trying to make it, to smooth it out and make it to sound like, and to be understood as it was in the original writings. And what the original writings look like, we talked about last time. So you can go back and kind of look at what those translations would have looked like, those copies.
For someone who's brand new to reading the Bible, you study out of the ESV. Is that what you would recommend?
Yeah, I would. But let's talk about the King James for a minute. Okay. So the King James Version, there are a lot of Baptists, and I grew up with some Baptists that felt this way, and a lot of our more fundamentalist friends that are going to say that the King James Version is the only true translation. That's an unfortunate thing. People get really worked up about this, and I've heard it. I've been on the receiving end of their anger. There's plenty of churches in this area that are that way, and they would just, everything we're saying here is total heresy to them. They wouldn't even walk in these doors because we don't use King James. But the problem with that is that the King James was a brilliant and amazing accomplishment for the 17th century, 1611. But, there's a lot of things that have changed since 1611.
Sure.
And not just in terms of, we don't wear the funny little hats anymore that they wore, but in terms of our scholarship. And in those days, they would have had examples of what we call, most of what they translated from was from 11th, 12th, and 13th century, what we call Byzantine manuscripts. And we have some pictures of these. They look kind of like what we were looking at in our last time. Let's go to the other one. I want to see the other one that we have. Yeah, this is a little bit better example.
Okay.
The one that we just showed just for a split second was a 10th century. This is, I think, a 12th, 13th century example.
Okay.
Top line says Evangelion, which is a gospel, and then kata of, and then Mark.
Okay.
So this is the first page. This is the kind of manuscript that they would have been using. And some of them are very good, but they're 11, 12, 1,300 years removed from the original writing. And if you go back and watch the other episode, when we were looking at some of those other manuscripts, some of those go back all the way within 25 years of the original writing. Well, the modern translations take advantage of those older manuscripts.
Okay.
The King James Version, the people who translated it did not have that. And in some instances, they didn't even have Greek manuscripts. They were having to work from Latin copies.
Okay.
Very interesting stuff.
Okay.
So I think the King James Version is beautiful, poetic. It's what I memorized scripture when I was little.
Yeah.
We still use it in Bible drill. It is not a bad translation at all. Yeah. It's not a matter of bad. It's a matter of better when we do a modern translation. And a modern translation is based on a Greek, basically a text. So I have one in my office. It's the Nestle and Alland. I have the 27th edition. And what it does is it has the best guess that scholars have as to what the Greek manuscript looked like with the variants, the different, like, well, this is a little different here, a little different there, and the handwritten copies of the originals that we have manuscripts. And so the modern translations are using that Greek text to translate into English from. Okay. So that's why I like a modern translation, because it really does. A modern translation can take advantage of all the discoveries of manuscripts that we've had in the last several hundred years. Okay. And we've really learned a lot more about the Greek language and the Hebrew language. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, we've talked mostly about New Testament, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and it gave us a whole new view on the Hebrew language. And so we're able today, scholars are, to really give us a translation that I feel like is as close to the original as you can get with any ancient document. Yeah,
that's really interesting to me. I knew a little bit of that on the King James Version, but just hearing it from that's great. So I brought quite the stack of books.
I see this.
I came in with my arms loaded down, but I do think we want to put resources in our parents' hands. And so I have 7 Bibles here.
It's a good number.
Storybooks, yes. And so I'm going to quickly go through that because I know you have some resources to share as well. And so I'm going to start with our youngest and kind of work our way up. So, I oversee babies through 6th grade. And so I'm going to kind of talk about some of my favorites, recommendations. And so even things like a very basic storybook Bible. I love this. It has Bible stories in it. So it's not just, there's lots of great books about the Bible for little ones. I use this when I'm teaching toddlers, and I do some fun things like I'll hide something like a cutout in the story we're going to talk about, and they get to find it. Thank you, Greg. But then, they just keep getting with more content. And so here's another great storybook Bible, big book of Bible stories. I'm going to go through these quickly. But then this is, another step up. This has even more. It's super interactive. This is a new resource, the Beginner's Gospel Story Bible. I'm actually excited. There's a whole curriculum that goes with this that we're going to dive into and do the whole Bible in a year on Wednesday nights next year. I am really excited about this resource. This would be the one I would tell parents to get if they're looking for a storybook Bible for toddlers. So that's kind of where we start with the little bitties. My next favorite for for that younger age is the Read to Me Bible. This is what I had in my office. There's a new version of it that has a new cover, but this is really cool because it's a full text Bible. It's this is the Holman Christian Standard. There's a new one with CSB, but it has some pictures in it, but it's still the full text. But on the other side of each picture, it has kind of a paraphrase version of that story, and even broken down more. There's bold bold words versus the regular text. And that is if you're reading it to even younger, just read the bold. And so this is a really great, if you are trying to tell stories to your little one and trying to figure out, how to go from full text to stories, but you're wanting to read from a full text Bible, this is really great. And it has tons of good parenting resources in it. So Read to Me Bible, that's what we teach out of in preschool classes.
Awesome.
So here, the Beginner Story Bible, this is the version for older, the Gospel Story Bible. I just realized I actually left my most favorite new resource on my desk. So we'll link to that. But the Gospel Story Bible. So it's another storybook, but it's for older kids. And then I'm actually going to jump straight to this one. So this is full text CSB Bible. This is what we give to our kindergartners or first graders when we're giving their Bible when they move on to kids ministry. But this it's a full text Bible, but it has some really cool resources in it on just different Bible history, and it has. Let's see. I bet your Bible doesn't have this in it.
I was going to say, all of your Bibles are so much more fun than mine.
One thing that I love about this is it has 75 highlighted verses in it. So 75 key verses that we think kids should memorize. It's already highlighted for them. But one of my favorite features, I've got to find a page with it, has great information about where the book came from, who wrote it, but it has QR codes. Does your Bible come complete with QR codes?
No, it does not.
So this, if you scan that, it takes you to a Bible lesson.
But look at this over here. If you can just show that is a cuneiform tab. So this has some wonderful, what we're trying to do in our podcast where we show pictures when we're talking about certain ways that people wrote.
Yes.
This is something we didn't talk about is even before scrolls, they would have used these little wedge pins, and that's the cuneiform. And you see an example of that was in so that was fire. Fired. So you have a clay tablet, and then you turn it into a piece of pottery, and then it lasts all these years. But see how cool that is that is using multimedia, and there's some examples of some carvings and things of that nature. That's cool.
Yeah. It has character. It'll say character field guide. And so Isaiah and all the things, when he was born, what his name means, his occupation, his relatives, his claim to fame. So this is my number one Bible recommendation for kids. It's full of great resources, but it's a full text Bible. And so this is one that can carry them through. This is what I teach out of and use on a regular weekly basis.
That's a good example of a study Bible.
Yeah.
So that's not just a Bible, that's a study Bible that has all those extra learning aids in them. So that's one thing we want to distinguish between, because adults, I want you to know, you guys have the same opportunity. So the English Standard Version Study Bible is the one I always recommend. It's not as colorful.
Right.
It's not as fun.
It's what I use at home, though.
Right. And you have the footnotes, you have pictures, you have study aids, but that is really that had some good meat in it.
It's incredible. Kids. Yeah. It's incredible. There is a new one, Colby, I'll make sure to get you this link. And the name is escaping me, but it's a brand new Bible that is a storybook Bible, but it has the 3 circles woven into it. So in each of these, I believe there's 24 stories, and in each one it shows the 3 circles. So where the fall, where you see that Christ connection even through the Old Testament, and it shows you that, which is great opportunities to have the conversation with kids of, the meta narrative and one big story, all of that with kids, by being able to show, in each of these Bible stories where we can see God at work.
Yeah, and I think it's important, today we live in a very multimedia, heavily saturated with images and illustrations. you and I joke about, my books being boring and yours being more fun, but the reality is that to get people involved in the Word, if we just start with the black and white page with words on a page kind of thing, we may not be able to get people to see, the deeper things. Whereas these multimedia opportunities, and we've already talked about this, but all the online options that we have, the Bible app is just absolutely wonderful because all of the translations we've talked about and many more, dozens and dozens, you can compare and contrast. And if you really get into the different translations, and I tell people, instead of learning Greek, or Hebrew, what you could do is get an interlinear where you have 3 or 4, sometimes they'll do 2 on each side of the page. And as you're looking at how the different translations go, what you're looking at there is how that Greek or Hebrew word, the different range of meaning that it has. So you're not having to learn the Hebrew or Greek word, but you're seeing the different range of meaning and how this particular group of translators went one direction and this particular group of translators went a different direction. And you're able to get, I think, a more holistic and well-rounded view of a passage that way. That can be a little confusing. I would say that's like a little bit more down the road, advanced when you're doing Bible study, or if there's a passage that's really important to you and you don't feel like you're getting everything out of it and you don't want to take the time to learn ancient languages, that's the way to do it. But I love this this creative kind of intermingling of text and resources, QR codes in a Bible.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
That's the first time I've ever seen that. And of course you would be the one to show me that because I would have never guessed. But yay for the Christian Standard Bible people. They got something going on there. That looks like an excellent work.
A few years ago, 4 years ago, actually this month, I had an opportunity to begin discipling a young college girl who was a brand new believer, had no history in church. And we walked through a storybook Bible because she didn't know any of the stories, all those things that we take for granted. And I often tell kids, on a Sunday morning, okay, we're talking about the story of Noah's Ark today. I know you've heard this story, by the time they're in elementary ministry, they've heard it 8 to 10 times, if not more. And, I'm always telling them look for new things. But, she was 19, had never heard of, she had heard names, but she didn't know anything. And so dive into a storybook Bible.
I couldn't, that may be one of the most important things we talk about here today. And that is one of the blind spots the church has is, again, not realizing how special the scriptures are and how blessed they are to have that woven into their minds and hearts. But the people we're trying to reach in our culture are more and more biblically illiterate.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't mean they're illiterate or dumb. Illiterate in this instance just means they weren't raised with it.
Absolutely. Even this sweet girl was very well read and a very intelligent young lady, but had zero Bible knowledge.
Yeah, and this is where, like in America and American history, when you go back 100 years, the Bible was part of the curriculum. And people say, "Oh my goodness, can you imagine? That's just terrible." No, it wasn't. It was just, a way for people to learn and to grow. People still weren't being forced to become a Baptist or a Methodist or anything else. But what we've done is
piece of literature.
Well, yeah, we're afraid that since it's a religious text, we can't have it, and that somehow is a bad thing. But what we've done is we've taken like some of the foundational pieces of Western civilization and thrown them out the window instead of building on them. And so when we run into a person who is relatively well educated but biblically illiterate, I would say that's not an educated person because they're missing one of the most important books, in the Western corpus. And so, for me, when I find a book that is, I think, fundamental, like a very important, even if it's a book that's not necessarily in my wheelhouse, but people say this is a book that's been very influential over the years, I want to read that because I want to understand what shapes minds and cultures. Well, the Bible has shaped minds and cultures for 2,000 years, and to not have read that, to me, is to miss out on one of the most important things in our culture today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see you have a couple books there. Is that something you were going to recommend, or did we hit on that in the first episode?
We kind of hit on those.
Okay.
And what we'll do is the books that I had to recommend fit more in the realm of how the Bible came
okay.
before the printing press, right? And so what we're talking about here today in terms of translations, we're really going from the Gutenberg Bible forward till today. So the first episode is really focused on before Gutenberg, and this one is post Gutenberg, although we've really not talked so much about that. But these modern translations, I want people to not be afraid of them. I think that they're very helpful. I think that they're using the information that's out there. I think we need to approach every translation just like we do every person, realizing that they're fallible, that the translators aren't always perfect, but the word is perfect. Yeah. And I know that may sound like a contradiction, but the different translations, when we begin to look at them, the most important things about our faith, it's all there. Yeah. And there's even the passages that are sometimes argued over and in question, they're not challenging fundamental doctrines. In other words, there's not like a whole translation or a whole bunch of manuscripts out there that say that Jesus is not the Son of God. Sure. There's not a ton out there that are going against a doctrine like justification by faith. It just that's when people talk about all these different translations and how can the Bible be true. They're not really taking into consideration what the message of the Bible is. Yeah. And those translations may give us some insight here or there, but they're not changing fundamental doctrines. And so we need to have, I would say it's so important to be gracious with one another about translations. I'm not a huge fan of the NLT, but if a new Christian is able to read the Bible, it's the same as what we're talking about. Each one of those different levels you showed us.
Absolutely.
It kind of like, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. I think maybe after one of the kids' Bibles that you said that was for maybe an adolescent, maybe the New Living Translation is the next best step. And then the NIV and then the ESV. I don't know. That's one possibility. But some people, their whole lives, they just say, I just feel like this, I can understand this better. Yeah. Well, then read that.
Read it. Absolutely. That's what I was just thinking, that like whatever you do find of these trusted translations. Yeah. Read your Bible.
Read your Bible, and don't get too caught up in that. I think that the people I know that argue about translations, they've got too much time on their hands. Because for the most part, I know if I'm just in a hurry and I go to my office, whatever Bible I'm pretty well pulling off the shelf, I feel confident that I'm going to be able to get the point across. And, the language has changed a lot, even in the last 20 years. And so translations, you say, well, why do they keep making more and more translations? Well, they have to, because the language is dynamic. English is dynamic. And so we're always trying to find a way to communicate most clearly with our culture. And so 900, well, that's a lot, but you don't really need to worry about that. Most of those you couldn't find if you wanted to. But when you go into a bookstore and let's say they have 10 different translations, for the most part, get the one that fits well. And again, a good study Bible. We haven't talked much about that.
Right, yeah.
Translation's important, but also if you're relatively new in the faith, it would be wise to get a Bible that has some footnotes and some references, some good maps, like that one Bible you showed me there, the Explorer's Bible. Yeah. All those wonderful little sidebars and pictures. That's all great. And then you can, if you're really interested in a particular subject, then you get online, Google it, and then you can go chase some rabbits. And it's amazing. There is so much out there that you can dig deep into.
Yeah. And especially helping you find those cross references. I love when I'm able to go down the rabbit hole of cross references when I'm using my study Bible.
Yeah, and so one more resource there would maybe be like Strong's Concordance, which they have some modern usages of that, or iterations of that. But that is, if you're wanting to really go down the rabbit hole, you get one of those. But most of the time, a typical Bible is going to have a center column with a lot of those references or some footnotes. So any modern Bible that you have, if you use it well, it will help you get to know Jesus better.
Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Hey Listen.